In the last lecture, we saw the leaders of the French Revolution attempt to demolish the Ancien Regime without eradicating the monarchy, the church, or other long-standing institutions in France. In other words, the early coalition that fought for the revolution, so radical in the eyes of the royal family, the church, and most aristocrats, in reality sought compromise. Like so many philosophes, they wanted to persuade, co-opt, and retain the king, the church, basic property rights, and male superiority. But from the first, there were extremists on either side. On the one hand, those who wanted a more radical revolution. On the other, those who still embraced the great chain of being and who saw any change at all in the Ancien Regime as a disaster and a sin. The resistance to the revolution by the latter, king, most aristocrats and clergy, and the invading great powers of Europe would ironically throw the revolution into the arms of the radicals. The crucial year was to be 1792. The situation in 1792 was dire. The king was forced to abide by the Constitution of 1791. Government leaders tried to cover up his attempted escape by saying that he'd been kidnapped. They still felt they needed him and they had no backup plan. Nobody believed them. Louis reluctantly accepted the new constitution on the 14th of September, 1791. But in reality, he was its prisoner, forced to watch as the new legislature attacked émigrés as enemies of the revolution, and the clergy were forced to take an oath of loyalty to the state. France, beset by enemies on her borders and thanks to the Royal Navy at sea, experienced a series of defeats. The old royal army was riven by faction and unreliable. The state was still laboring under its long-term debt, and many clergy railed against the revolution, encouraging their flocks to join counter-revolutionary mobs. At this stage, on the 10th of August, 1792, the revolution took a radical turn. A mob of ordinary citizens, sans-culottes, etc., stormed the Tuileries, demanded a republic, killed 600 Swiss guards. The royal family reacted by taking refuge with the Legislative Assembly. They had no other choice. The Legislative Assembly reacted by suspending the monarchy and agreeing to establish a national convention to hammer out a new republican constitution. That convention would share real power with the Paris Commune, run by the sans-culottes. The convention was to be the Paris Commune was an elected body and increasingly radical. Georges-Jacques Danton was appointed Minister of Justice. He established a special court to try the enemies of the revolution. But even this was not enough for the radical Paris workers, who stormed the jails for a solid week in early September, murdering or injuring nearly 1,000 such enemies of France. Clearly, law and order were crumbling under the pressure of foreign armies and of internal dissatisfaction. Even the convention was divided among the Girondins, moderates who still wanted to work with the king and establish a kind of federalism whereby local elites ran things in their localities, and the Jacobins, urged on by the sans-culottes and led by Maximilien Robespierre, who wanted to push the revolution in a more radical direction. He wanted to eliminate the king, establish a true republic under a central, all-controlling state. There was finally a third group in the convention, a moderate center called the Plain, because it existed between these two peaks of extremism. States of national emergency usually make the most radical solutions seem sensible. And so, on the 21st of September 1792, the new National Convention declared France a republic and began to draw up a new constitution. It also established a Committee of Public Safety and gave it the responsibility for running France while the Constitution was written. The Committee of Public Safety was to be dominated by Jacobin and Robespierre. It had three major areas of interest: war preparations, keep France safe; social engineering, change France from what had been on the Ancien Regime; and terror, to get the people to agree. First, war preparations. France, as we've seen, was ringed with enemies. To deal with this, the government established the Levée en Masse to raise an additional 300,000 men. The Levée en Masse was a national conscription for a national army. All unmarried adult males and childless widowers now became members of the French army. Now, this thing was vast. When combined with the old Royal Army, eventually the French army reached a figure of 1.5 million men by the fall of 1794. That's 5 times the size of the armies of Louis XIV. The Committee of Public Safety also reformed the army, installing promotion on merit, and any officer of aristocratic background, even if he was for the revolution, was purged. But not everyone was inspired by the Marseillaise. Angry at Republican attacks on church and king and encouraged by conservative clergy, peasant rebellions broke out in the West in 1793. In Brittany, guerrilla bands, aided by the British, attacked towns which supported the revolution. In the Vendée, a counter-revolution army arose. Both sides engaged in terrible atrocities. For example, at Massacoul, rebels executed 500 revolutionaries by forcing them into a mass grave, then shooting them. Remember, these are conservative rebels against the revolution doing this. Revolutionary troops responded by loading barges with prisoners near Nantes and sinking them in the Loire River. As this implies, the suppression of these rebellions by the revolutionary government was ruthless and eventually took 100,000 lives. But at the front, the military reforms worked. The levée en masse overwhelmed smaller professional armies, and by the fall of 1793, the enemy had been pushed back beyond the borders of France. In the summer of 1794, the Austrians were driven out of the Austrian Netherlands, that is, Belgium, which was proclaimed the Batavian Republic, but it was really a vassal state to France. So, what had been a war of liberation to save France and to preserve the revolution was now in the mid-1790s becoming a war of conquest to spread the revolution beyond France's borders. Stay tuned for that. In the meantime, the Jacobins sought via social engineering to create a perfectly egalitarian and secular society, even if that meant infringing on personal liberties. First, they established the right to free, compulsory public education for everybody, boys and girls. They also established the right to public welfare for the poor, and price controls on bread. There was a terrible inflation running, if you'll remember. However, they also abolished the right of workers to form associations and unions and to go on strike. They got rid of old guild restrictions, but they also got rid of organizations that helped workers and gave them a sense of belonging. The needs of the state took precedence. In terms of culture, the new regime was aware of how deeply the assumptions of the Ancien regime were embedded in French culture, and so the Jacobins attempted a revolution in culture as well. They abolished titles like Monsieur and Madame and replaced them with citizen. They censored the arts. They encouraged revolutionary themes in literature, in posters and pamphlets, in everyday pottery, even in playing cards. They even established a new non-Christian calendar dating from the revolution. They encouraged revolutionary festivals to replace the old church holidays. This was all part of what was intended to be the de-Christianization of France. The statues on the walls of Notre Dame were actually beheaded as part of this process. This was at once an attempt to level society, but it was also to wreak revenge for anti-revolutionary activities on the part of nobles and the clergy. And finally, it was intended to replace the superstitions of organized Christianity with a cult of reason. They even replaced the old royal measurements with the metric system, which of course is so beloved on this side of the Atlantic. But French revolutionary reason had its darker side as well. And so we come to the Reign of Terror. With the revolution beset on all sides, everyone came under suspicion as enemies of the revolution. The feelings of nationalistic alarm at France's external enemies now turned inward. Listen to this letter from the Jacobin Club in 1793. Friends, we are betrayed. To arms, to arms. The terrible hour is at hand when the defenders of the patrie must vanquish or bury themselves under the bloody ruins of the Republic. Frenchmen, never was your liberty at such peril. Okay, that sounds like the Marseillaise. We've heard that before. But there's a twist. Your greatest enemies are in your midst. Yes, the counter-revolution is in the convention. It is there, at the center of your security and your hope, that criminal delegates hold the threads of the web they have woven with the horde of despots who come to butcher us. Let us rise. Let us all arrest the enemies of our revolution and all suspected persons. This masterpiece of paranoia makes Joe McCarthy sound like a moderate. The Committee of Public Safety decided that these enemies would have to be eliminated by show trials and executions. They began with the king. He was indicted on a series of charges on the 11th of December, 1792. He was accused of attacking the sovereignty of the people. He was accused of tyranny, of making war on the French people, and of working to overthrow the Constitution. He was tried and found guilty on the 15th of January, 1793. The vote for immediate execution won by one vote. On the 21st, just after 10 a.m., Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. At first, he resisted the attempts to tie his hands, but eventually was persuaded and said, "Do what you wish, I will drain the cup to the dregs." He ascended the steps slowly, but seemed to gain courage once on the platform, proclaiming, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I pardon the authors of my death, and pray God that the blood you are to shed will never fall on France." As the henchmen raised the severed head for the crowd to see, they cried, "Long live the Republic!" But of course, anything else would have been very dangerous. Other members of the royal family soon followed, and this produced a wave of revulsion throughout Europe. On the 2nd of June, the Jacobins began to arrest Girondin leaders as not sufficiently revolutionary. On the 5th of September, the convention approved the bases of the Reign of Terror. On the 9th, it established a sans-culotte paramilitary to enforce internal obedience. On the 17th, it passed the law of suspects. Anyone could be charged with vague crimes against liberty. In June of 1794, it deprived the accused of legal counsel. Now, the victims of the terror comprised first royalist noblemen and anyone of noble birth. Then it included clergy and other conspirators against the revolution. 135 priests were executed at Lyon in November 1793. 83 were shot in one day in the Vendée. Numerous bourgeois and peasants were also arrested and killed for having fought against the revolution or simply expressing an unpopular opinion. Slandering patriotism and encouraging discouragement were capital crimes. Listen to the story of a poor pregnant woman caught up in the Reign of Terror, and as you listen, remember that it was traditionally women who were responsible for putting food on the table. "For a long time, I have had to feed the members of my household on bread and cheese, and tired of complaints from my husband and my boys, I was compelled to wait in line to get something to eat. For 3 days, I've been going to the same market without being able to get anything, despite the fact that I waited all day. After the distribution of butter on the 22nd, a citizen came over to me and said I was in a very delicate condition. I replied, 'You can't be delicate and be on your legs for so long.' After urging her to leave the line and go home, I answered that, if he was sensitive to the difficulty of obtaining food because of rationing in the war, he would not vex me so, and that he was an imbecile and wanted to play despot. And no one had that right. I was arrested on the spot and led to the Revolutionary Committee, where I was called a counter-revolutionary and was told that I was asking for the guillotine because I told them that I preferred death to being treated ignominiously." Now, a couple things here. Note how little people get caught up in these great political events. But note that they have their own sense of enlightenment. She knows what a despot is. Quote, again, "For these and other answers, I was told that I had done 3 times more than was needed to get the guillotine, and that I would be explaining myself before the Revolutionary Tribunal." In the end, she only escaped by pleading her pregnancy. Finally, anyone in opposition to the Jacobins and Robespierre, including Danton, for example, was executed. Robespierre justified this with cold logic. "The first maxim of your policies must be to lead the people by reason and the people's enemies by terror. Without virtue, terror is deadly. Without terror, virtue is impotent." To preserve itself, the revolution was growing ever more radical. It was devouring its own children. Soon, it spiraled out of control. Between June and July 1794, 1,300 people were executed in Paris alone. The guillotine was averaging 26 victims a day by midsummer. Overall, 250,000 were arrested. 17,000 were tried and executed. 12,000 guillotined without trial. Untold thousands died in jail, including the king's son, Louis XVII. Edmund Burke, an Irish member of Parliament, had predicted the madness in 1791. To make a government requires no great prudence. To give freedom is still more easy. But to form a free government, that is, to temper together those opposite elements of liberty and restraint in one consistent work, requires much thought, deep reflection, a sagacious and powerful and combining mind. He argued that the moderate voice necessary to do this would inevitably be drowned out in revolutionary emotion. Remember emotion? Suspicions will be raised of his fidelity to his cause. Moderation will be stigmatized as the virtue of cowards and compromise the prudence of traitors, until the popular leader is obliged to become active in propagating doctrines and establishing powers that will afterwards defeat any sober purpose at which he ultimately might have aimed. Eventually, even the National Convention came to agree with Burke. The Reign of Terror produced the Thermidorian reaction, named after the revolutionary month of Thermidor, what we call July in 1794. In that month, a group of Jacobins in the convention, fearful that they were next, brought charges against Robespierre himself, who was arrested on the 27th of July, 1794, and executed, along with his followers. This put an end to the madness. The National Convention later broke the sans-culottes. So, as in the English Civil War, France had cut off the head of its king and cut itself off from its most ancient traditions, monarchy, the church, even the old Roman and Catholic calendar. It had tried a radical republic and found it to be madness. Now, as in England in the 17th century, the revolution would turn back towards moderation, even conservatism, though not easily, because of course extremists on both sides still wanted to hijack it. The next constitution took 3 years to draw up, and it resulted in something called the Directory. As I joke to my students, France ruled by a telephone book. The new constitution appeared in 1795, and in many ways it was a step back, a return to propertied, middle-class, if not yet aristocratic control. In structure, it consisted of an executive with a 5-man board selected by a legislature. The legislature consisted of 2 houses, a council of ancients and a council of 500, who were elected by property owners, 30,000 of the wealthiest male citizens in France. Now, the Directory was consistently unpopular. It was neither fish nor fowl. It was beset by enemies on both sides of the political spectrum. In May of 1796, the directors crushed a rebellion on the left of former Jacobins. In September 1797, they thwarted counter-revolutionaries, conservatives, hoping to seize power after a right turn in the elections. 200 conservative legislators were purged, and some were executed. In 1798, after the radical left did well in those elections, 100 of these were purged from the assembly as well. By then, the Directory had lost all claim to democratic legitimacy. The revolution was turning into an anti-philosophe nightmare. The upper class was fearful, the lower classes wanted more. The directors were known to be corrupt. They pursued an aggressive military policy, mainly to distract the populace from their corruption, the depressed economy, and they did that with some success. In 1795, the anti-French, anti-revolutionary alliance collapsed. Prussia, the Netherlands, Spain, and Sardinia all signed peace treaties, which left only Britain and Austria in the field. As we've seen, France had annexed the Austrian Netherlands, and in 1796-97, French armies pushed into Italy. But by the second half of the 90s, most of the country was sick to death of war, high taxes, high prices, constitutions, directors. Frenchmen began to long nostalgically for the good old days when they were ruled by a strong king. That may help to explain the rise of another strong man, a French Cromwell, who would seize the revolution, extend it, reinvigorate it, and betray it. That man was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. He was of minor nobility, and it was a poor family, and he wasn't even technically a Frenchman. At age 9, he was sent to military school. Like William of Orange, he spent his entire youth in military camps. He graduated in 1785 at age 16. He entered the French army as a lieutenant of artillery. Early on, he tied his star to the revolution. And he was able to rise really quickly because, if you'll remember, the aristocratic officers had all been purged or guillotined. And so Napoleon was a general by the age of 24. Now, he also earned that title in that he experienced and won a number of early victories. He took the royalist French city of Toulon in 1793. He suppressed the riots against the Directory in 1795, and he swept through Italy in 1797. There, he established a puppet pro-French Cisalpine Republic in the north. He negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, which gave France territory along the Rhine that Louis XIV would have dreamed of. France was now an empire again. It sought to extend the revolution to all of Europe via satellite republics in Western Germany, Switzerland, the former Papal States. In 1798, it encouraged a failed Irish rebellion against Britain, which was put down ruthlessly. Now, Napoleon's success brought him to the attention of the lead director, Paul-François Vicomte de Barras. Barras's position was not unlike that of Crassus under the old Roman Republic. He was unpopular. He needed a star, a Caesar, to sort of hitch to revive the popularity of the revolution, the popularity of himself. The trouble with that was, as with young Caesar, the young Napoleon proved a little too successful. He soon eclipsed his patron. He did that in 1798 by invading Egypt. Why Egypt, you may ask? Well, Napoleon said it was to liberate it from the Ottoman Empire. This is all part of the revolutionary program, you know? More likely, it was to interrupt British trade in the Mediterranean. Most likely, it was because, just like Caesar when he conquered Britain in 55 BCE, there was no real strategic significance to Egypt, not to France, but this would play great in the hometown papers. So Napoleon made sure to have journalists come with him on the expedition and portray him, you know, there's Napoleon conquering an ancient empire. There's Napoleon viewing the pyramids. Hey, look, it's Napoleon encouraging archaeology. And indeed, Napoleon's people found the Rosetta Stone, which proved to be such an important discovery for understanding Egyptian hieroglyphics. But he also did he must be given some credit for bringing the revolution to Africa. Napoleon abolished serfdom and torture in the areas he conquered. He reformed Egyptian government and law. He established the concept of the rights of man. He might have done more, but his supplies were soon cut off by the Royal Navy under an equally young and dashing officer, Admiral Horatio Nelson, who defeated a French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in August of 1798. Nelson would be a thorn in Napoleon's side again and again. Napoleon, realizing that the jig was up, abandoned his army in the desert and returned home to a hero's welcome, just in time to plot against the Directory. On the 9th and 10th of November, 1799, Napoleon led troops against the Directory, an internal coup. The Directory was forced to dissolve itself. France was to be ruled by 3 consuls, with Napoleon as the head consul. Now, this was approved by a plebiscite, what we would call a referendum, but in fact, millions of people boycotted. They're so cynical about this, they don't care. And so the turnout was so bad that the government had to fake the results. Now, though a military man, Napoleon realized that France was, after 10 years of revolution, an internal mess. He concluded, like Louis XIV after the Fronde, that France was badly in need of the restoration of strong central government before it could face its external enemies. In the end, Napoleon would lay the foundations for a governmental structure and bureaucracy which survive today. France is ruled today through Napoleonic bureaucratic procedures. But the first step was to take the heat off from France's enemies. In 1799, a new anti-French alliance had formed. Joining the usual suspects, you know, Britain, Austria, etc., were new enemies, Russia, the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon had to do something about this, so he completed a series of whirlwind campaigns, winning victories against Spain, Portugal, Austria, Prussia, and Britain, climaxing in his brilliant defeat of the Austrians at Marengo. All of Europe was now ready for peace, and the result was the Treaty of Amiens, signed in 1801. Now, everyone knew that this was just a truce. It only lasted 2 years. But that 2 years truce left Napoleon able to concentrate on domestic reform. His domestic reforms look, on the surface, to be liberal, egalitarian, and revolutionary. But in the end, if you look more closely, they owe more to Louis XIV than they do to Voltaire, Rousseau, or Robespierre. Napoleon's domestic reforms. Well, first, in law, Napoleon encouraged the drawing up of a new series of law codes. Does this sound familiar? At this point, you should be thinking enlightened despot, right? The new codes were known as the Code Napoleon. The Code Napoleon is still the basis of law in France and in Louisiana, which was, of course, ruled by France at the time. Basically, Napoleon took various legal traditions in France and, like a good Enlightenment ruler, he put them together and he made them consistent. From henceforward, all were to be equal under the law. There was to be no privilege. But Napoleon's law put the rights of the state over those of the citizen. It put the rights of property over those of the poor. It put the rights of employers over those of workers, and the rights of husbands over those of wives, who had no property rights. It put the rights of fathers over children, so that fathers could actually imprison their children for disobedience. Napoleon, like a good Enlightenment ruler, provided public education, but only for boys. Girls were expected to be housewives and mothers. Moreover, the education he provided was mainly indoctrination in strict patriotism and loyalty to Napoleon. In terms of finance, Napoleon was smart enough to follow the English model. He established a national bank which served as a repository of government funds and made loans to French businesses and printed money. He stabilized the currency and he imposed a fair tax burden on the French people in the sense that no one was exempt from taxation. Now, again, all of that is consistent with the Enlightenment, but it also made Napoleon's finances, his government finances, much more robust. So it benefits him as much as it benefits the people, if not more. In terms of religion, Napoleon was not a religious man. But like the Bourbon monarchs, he saw that religion was useful to the state in supporting its power, in keeping people in line. The Catholic Church, for its part, was hoping to get back some of the power that it had lost at the Revolution. And so in 1801, Napoleon and the Pope signed a treaty, or concordat. Religious toleration remained the law in France, but the Roman Catholic Church was officially recognized as the religion of the majority of Frenchmen. Confiscations of church land ceased, but previously confiscated land would not be returned. And Napoleon appointed the bishops. In terms of administration, Napoleon kept everything strictly in his own hands. He established a council and a legislature. That sounds like the Enlightenment, but its members were chosen by Napoleon, and so they became a rubber stamp. The press was censored. The number of papers in France was reduced from 73 to 4. As far as local administration was concerned, Napoleon made sure that the prefects of all 83 departments reported to him personally on everything going on in their districts, and he established a secret police to monitor opposition and to drag dissenters and dissidents away. So Napoleon began as a soldier of the Revolution, a man of relatively common birth who rose to the top through merit, a philosophe's dream. He rose to power to preserve the Revolution. He claimed to have saved it, then spread it throughout Europe. "I am the revolution on horseback," he said. But once in power, Napoleon made himself the absolute ruler of France, turning a revolutionary state into an authoritarian one. After all, he dominated the administration of government, he dominated the wealth of France, he dominated the religion of France, and of course, he was the undisputed commander of the army. Does this all sound familiar? Do you remember Louis XIV and his 5 rules of absolutism? Napoleon had now followed 4. He was in control of the government, he was in control of France's wealth, he was in control of religion, and he was in control of the army. There remained only one rule left unfulfilled. Napoleon was not yet a god. In 1802, he had himself proclaimed first consul of France for life. In 1804, he decided to assume the title of emperor. Famously, at the ceremony presided over by the Pope, Napoleon crowned himself. Not for him to be appointed by the church, not for him to be beholden to anybody. In a way, this is the self-made revolutionary man, but a man who used the revolution to become an absolute monarch. This is ironic, yet fitting. Napoleon was a product of the revolution, a self-made man. Yet he used that opportunity to make himself a king, an emperor, the very thing that the revolution most detested. Note that in this lecture, we have come full circle from monarchy back to monarchy. Now, an emperor needs an empire. When we return, Napoleon seeks to win one for France, for the revolution, and for himself.